Which is it?
I'm Zeb Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College. And today I'm with a very good friend, Professor Rachel Gordan. She is the Shorstein Fellow in American Jewish Culture at the University of Florida. Rachel teaches in the Department of Religion in the Center of Jewish Studies, and also at the University of Florida. Rachel's doing something really wonderful and unique in the field. I think that there's a particular emphasis on scholarship in the post-war period, and so many of us wonder how much of our history and how so much of our research resonates with the contemporary scene. And what Professor Gordan, what you've been able to do so well is demonstrate how American Jewish studies, not just American Jewish history, because you are so much at home in literature and history and both intertwine with American culture and American religion. What you've been able to demonstrate in your writings is just how impactful the post-war period is and how you can draw a line, not always a straight line, to show how the Jewish experience today was formed over the last several decades. So thanks so much for joining.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
And also in terms of methodology, I think that what you're able to do is coalesce the fields of American studies and modern Jewish history, really. How have you been able, in terms of your own research agenda, what have you been able to research in the 1950s and the 1960s? I know that you're very much at home in the 1950s, but also in the 1960s. What lenses do you use, and what have you been able to unearth that I don't know if necessarily has changed, because not so many people have written about it. But what have you been able to explicate to demonstrate what has been so impactful on this period?
Well, I guess starting in grad school, I was really interested in, what kind of changes did happen in the mid-20th century. And I remember knowing I was interested in the 50s and the mid-century and doing one of those searches that a lot of us do in the New York Times website, where I was looking for articles on Jews between 1920 and like 1960 or 1970, and sort of, got a bunch of those and was then looking, right, what change over time am I seeing in how this particular newspaper is talking about and discussing Jews? And I really did notice that in the 20s and the 30s and even the very early 40s, the discussion is around really Jews as a problem. And then in the mid-20th century, and particularly in the post-war period, we get much more of Jews as members of a religion, and even much more about Judaism. So the Jews as a problem were articles, about anti-Semitism and refugees and what's going on in Europe. But it was not thinking and talking about Jews as members of a religion. So I remember in grad school thinking, what happens mid-century that the conversation around Jews and kind of mainstream America and media switches to this religion-y discourse. And that was the question that I was then trying to answer. And of course, many of our colleagues have really contributed to this understanding, and to my understanding, thinking Deborah Dash Moore, with Jews in the military, Kevin Schultz talking about Tri-Faith America. But and then recently, and actually really for the past several decades, we've seen wonderful scholarship on Judeo-Christianity. So one thing I notice is there's a good amount on that after period of what has Judeo-Christianity meant for different groups, but still the dynamics of change. How do we actually go from Jews as problem, and as Eric Goldstein has pointed out, it's Jews as race, or and in America, race often equals problem. So how do we go from Jews as racial problem to Jews as members of an American religion? And so a lot of my work has been focused on the dynamics of that change, and what that means then is I'm looking at a cultural moment in America. What is happening in the US that it no longer is part of the American brand almost to be anti-Semitic in the 20s and 30s. That was just in the air, or as I tell my students, it was so taken for granted. Jews didn't question it even. They just sort of knew, I'm not going to apply for this college. I'm not going to try to buy a home in this neighborhood. I'm going to be friends with or date these people or seek this kind of employment because those are the only options I have. So how does that become just so pervasive to then a post-war period when we see, and what really struck me was the popular culture, when we see all this popular culture making it clear that the American brand is now that one is supposed to be at least publicly opposed to anti-Semitism. So changes in views towards anti-Semitism, changes in views towards members of a religion, changes in views towards religion and what pluralism in America mean. That's kind of all part of this, stew that I'm trying to sort of describe and explain. And in terms of my popular culture approach, this is, of course, informed partly by the fact that I was an American Studies major when I was an undergrad at Yale. And also, like all of us scholars, it's the interests we bring. And I remember reading Marjorie Morningstar actually when I was 12, probably like many young people did. And even being struck then, I'd gone to a Jewish day school in Newton, Massachusetts, and I'd, read some Jewish literature, but I remember even feeling like there's something new and different here because I had not yet read, a novel that was so about a Jew who was from a traditional background, but who was modern and really and really seemed to have it was a very American story, and it struck me. So I guess I'm saying that often these sources we choose, and so part of the reason I might be drawn to some of these popular culture stories is that they sort of made me wonder, what's going on here and how did we get to this moment?
And what's so interesting about the way they research Herman Wouk and other middlebrow and popular culture exponents is also looking at how they were received. You're interested not only in the elite, but also understanding how religion was lived, and also talk about the stew mixed in to general culture. And what you say, and another point that I want you to speak to is it's not just about Jews, but it's about Judaism. And when we speak about Judaism and not just Jews, what's important isn't just how it was received by Jews, but also by non-Jews in America around them.
Yeah, that was also a grad school moment. I was in a religion program in grad school, and I was the only one in my cohort doing Judaism that year. But I remember I was looking at the books in my field, wonderful books that you and I know in American Jewish history, and how I couldn't even find religion in the index of most of these books, which is fine. We don't all have to have the same interests. But, what it showed me is that, we haven't been talking about the religion category with American Jews. I think in the past decade, we've seen more of that. People like you and me and our other friends and colleagues, but before that, it sometimes seemed like everything but religion, and that too was interesting. That only raised the question of why hasn't it been obvious to talk about or to study religion in American Jewish history?
So, if Judaism is the subject in the 1950s, how are Jews and non-Jews negotiating the expectation of pluralism and the fall, and it's always cyclical, of anti-Semitism? Meaning it's one thing to talk about how these movements and these institutions change over time, but I wonder, as historical actors, how are they negotiating new expectations in this? What you've proven probably better than anybody else is this pivotal 1950s. Every decade gets its champion. Why it's the latest and the greatest. And you made a very convincing argument about the 1950s.
I think the 50s are really important and interesting and also just really fun. But of course, it meant that in a way, I think the 40s too are at least as important. I have a article coming out, I think in February, on the 1940s in the Journal of Religion and American Culture, and how central this change in attitude was, because what we see in the 40s is in the beginning of that decade, FDR has to all but swear that if we enter the war, it will not be to save the Jews. That is how unpopular their cause is. And then by the end of that decade, we are really at this high tide of Judeo-Christianity. And so there's huge transformation going on there. And we see that in popular culture, like the Frank Sinatra short film from 1945 that many of us use in teaching, where he's got it's the House I Live In film, where he's teaching a bunch of schoolboys, and it looks like there's some anti-Semitic teasing going on, and he says to the schoolboys, that's Nazi behavior. I'm paraphrasing here, but he's making clear an American doesn't do that. And that's really the message, even though, as we know, a decade earlier, that was most certainly what an American did. And of course, it was still going on. But on the level of kind of public ideals, we see that kind of lesson being taught, which is also, of course, what Gentleman's Agreement does just a couple years later in 47. And, which is why that novel, which also featured non-Jews at its center, has, non-Jews teaching each other that it is un-American to be anti-Semitism. Part of what I find so important about Gentleman's Agreement in 47 is that while Frank Sinatra in 45 is teaching Americans that it's Nazi-like to be anti-Semitic, Hobson is saying, actually, it's kind of what a lot of us liberal Americans do. And it's this latent anti-Semitism. And I find that with my students, this really speaks to them in our own moment, because they recognize the calling out of microaggressions that it is, that we're all letting these things happen to marginalized groups, and we don't speak up, even though we think of ourselves as liberals. So I do think part of Hobson's genius there is that she's saying, actually, this isn't just the crackpots or the Nazis. It's all of us who could be speaking up more, who could be allies to the people who are being persecuted in a much stronger way. So the change, with your question about negotiating this change, it's Americans deciding, that to be anti-Semitic is now not being labeled as Nazi behavior, and Nazis have been coded as evil. So it's the Americans defining themselves in contrast to their European enemies. And then it also increasingly becomes part of the Cold War environment that as everyone needs a religion, Jews and other Americans are more focused on presenting and explaining Judaism as a religion. And something that I've found, which you've probably seen too, is that it's a surprise to see how much Judaism is described as a mystery, or, they use sort of adjectives like that. This is all so mysterious in the first half of the 20th century. And then it's really in the 40s and the 50s that we start to see the effort to explain it in American terms.
Jews and non-Jews, and that's why you work on Herman Wouk is his intentionality of speaking to a wider audience, and that I think really speaks to Judaism as a symbol, as a heightened symbol in American life in this post-war period, and maybe call it the long 1950s, or just maybe call it 3 different very important decades. Yeah. But how do Jews react to their faith and to their culture becoming an enlarged symbol of what Americans ought to be standing for?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking what comes to mind is, in the 50s, one of the things I've been writing about recently is when Life magazine does a couple of special issues on Judaism, and the kind of feedback Life then gets from Jews who, not surprisingly, are very sensitive about what kind of portrayal you're putting out there. And so I think it was in 55 when there was a special issue on Judaism, and there's a Orthodox woman on the cover of Life then, reciting the blessings over the candles. And a lot of, Reform and conservative Jews seem to feel this was a very exoticized version of Judaism. So I think we see that where there's that sensitivity and defensiveness that any minority or marginalized group feels when it's suddenly portrayals are put out there. How does this make us seem? But in a way, I mean, it's hard not to interpret it as a good thing, because it ends up spurring more efforts to explain. If Herman Wouk gets a chance, well, then everyone else also wants to give their version. And I guess I also make that connection between the 1940s anti-Semitism moment that you and I were just talking about with these instances of popular culture that really make that point of anti-Semitism being un-American, and then the move to explaining Judaism, which we see more in the late 40s and then 50s, is that you saw rabbis saying, all right, it's great that there's a film like Gentleman's Agreement, or that there's something like Frank Sinatra, or other novels too attacking anti-Semitism, but let's seize the opportunity that we now have the public's attention, and this seems to be interest and sympathy, to explain Judaism. So I think it builds on itself, because there's an interest that there had never been before. And when you see a magazine like Life choosing to do a special issue on Judaism, there's no way that rabbis, Jewish leaders, and Jewish writers don't take note and realize, oh, like there's a market now. If Life magazine is interested, and this is the value of studying popular culture, then people realize we're having a moment here.
Why should popular culture seize this moment? Why is it this venue that becomes so crucial for religious and political and cultural actors to play in that arena?
I think there's just, there's the realizing the kind of audience they have. I see this even in correspondence of, say, Milton Steinberg when he's working on basic Judaism, and he has the interest of non-Jewish editors and presses. And, he was from what I've read, he just seemed like he was such a dynamic rabbi anyway, from his pulpit, but to feel that the wider world has some interest is an opportunity that folks who care about Judaism, I think, just can't. How can they not take advantage of it? So I think it's just sort of seizing the moment for what it is. And we see, as you know too, we see a lot of rabbis and Jewish writers doing that in the mid-century.
Right. It almost seems that in the post-war period, maybe because they served as chaplains in World War II, maybe because of what Kevin Schultz has described as Tri-Faith America, there's this awareness that Jews ought to play a certain role in the broader American scene. That's really unprecedented in certain respect, maybe at least in scope in this post-war period.
Right. I mean, as I say, it's not the first time that Jews are making the case of Judaism as an American religion, but we never see this kind of concentrated effort also backed by the national culture and government. I guess the example I often bring up is the rabbis at the presidential inaugurations, the fact that we have them at all 4 mid-20th century inaugurations is the sign of their role in the American public sphere at this time.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.